We are now at 5 past, so we will get started. Thank you to everyone who joined for today's session. We are hosting our first session of a three-part series in celebration of National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. Today's session is entitled Black Men Heal, How Black Men's Depression and Trauma is Unseen and Underdiagnosed. And we are so fortunate to have our keynote speaker, Tasneem Suleiman, with us today. Just a bit of housekeeping as we get started for today. My name is Kelsey Leonard. I am the Cultural and Linguistic Competence Coordinator for the Pennsylvania Care Partnership, and we're just so excited to have everyone joining today. My email is also here on the slides. That's leonardkt@upmc.edu. I'll type that into the chat box, and I'd encourage everyone to locate your chat box now, your chat function, if you're joining by computer. There should be a ribbon of icons that will allow you to find the chat box comment little icon and click on that to find the chat box. And in there, you can introduce yourself, where you're from, say hello. Maybe you have additional peers that are joining on today's call. And that's where you can also find my email that I just posted. And for those that are curious about a link to the slides, I will be sharing those shortly. We just want to wait for a few more folks to join in so that everyone has access to the slides. Additionally, just some housekeeping, we will have a lot of opportunity for discussion throughout today's session. So if at any point in time you would like to ask a question or add a comment, please type it into the chat box. We'll be monitoring the chat box throughout today's session. And then at key points where we're opening it up for broad discussion, feel free to locate the participants button. And there, next to your name, you'll be able to raise a hand to flag for us to call on you or unmute you to join the conversation live, either with your video or just with your audio. So again, thank you to everyone. And if you have any tech difficulties while we're going through today's session, we will be recording the sessions and making those available to folks. So just bear with us. We know that we're all learning and growing during these difficult times with new technology. So we will do our best to try and meet your tech needs in real time. That said, we just wanted to provide a bit of background about how this session came to be and the continuing sessions. So July is National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. We really wanted to make you aware that mental health conditions do not discriminate based on race, color, gender, or identity. Anyone can experience the challenges of mental illness regardless of their background. However, background and identity can make access to mental health treatment much more difficult. And so in 2008, National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month was established. And each year, millions of Americans face the reality of having to live with a mental health condition, and particularly minority communities often face more barriers to recovery due to lack of access to healthcare, lower rates of medical coverage, cultural insensitivity of providers, and other biases and discrimination that can occur in the delivery of care. And so we really wanted to highlight the way in which these potential imbalances and disparities are impacting our communities across Pennsylvania. So we brought to you a few sessions over the course of July to really hone in and our learning opportunities for sharing and growing together across the state. That said, in addition to today's session, our next session will be next Thursday, July 23rd from 2:30 to 4, with our keynote speaker, Rakib Bey, from the Black Urban Gardeners and Farmers of Pittsburgh Cooperative, colloquially known as BUGS. And they're going to be talking about a program that they've developed through therapeutic gardening for youth healing, particularly for youth who have faced various traumas in their lives. So we hope that you can join that session, and make sure that you register in advance through the Zoom link that will be provided to you at the end of today's session, and also will be available in the slides for your download. Again, as I mentioned earlier, all of our sessions, as well as past cultural and linguistic competency sessions that we've hosted through the Pennsylvania Care Partnership, are available on our website. So if you go to the Pennsylvania Care Partnership, or pacarepartnership.org, you will be able to locate the CLC page where there are the Cultural and Linguistic Competency webinar series, and you'll be able to find all of our past webinar sessions, as well as the recording that we're taking for today's session and the slides. Those should be posted early next week. we're also going to make sure that I post the slides into the chat box in a few moments once our speaker gets started. So again, we really want to thank you for joining us today for our special session entitled Black Men Heal, How Black Men's Suppression and Trauma is Unseen and Underdiagnosed. I have the distinct pleasure and honor of introducing our keynote speaker, Tasneem Suleiman. Tasneem is a licensed professional counselor and a marriage and family therapist. Tasneem owns a private practice in the Philadelphia area and serves as a sexuality behavioral consultant to adults with intellectual disabilities and is an adjunct professor of human sexuality. Tasneem also enjoys training other therapists and serving as an expert speaker consultant for organizations, radio, and television. Tasneem has become passionate about relationship issues as well as men's issues and the importance of men seeking therapy for mental wellness. This passion has led to becoming the founder of Black Men Heal, a mission dedicated to offering free therapy to Black men and working to remove the stigma around mental health care. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Tasneem to continue her introduction and lead with today's session.
Thank you to CLC and PA Care Partnership for having me. It's such an honor and pleasure to be here today, especially during Minority Mental Health Month, which I am feeling a distinct honor specifically because of Black Men Heal and being the founder of Black Men Heal, which has already been such an honor and a pleasure for myself. So Kelsey already did an amazing job of introducing me. The only thing I would probably add to that question I get a lot that's so obvious is I do a lot of speaking and I get a lot of invitations and speaking around Black men's issues and Black male trauma. And that's because I'm the founder of Black Men Heal. But the most obvious thing here is that I am not a man, right? So I am a Black woman that has really devoted a lot of time and sacrifice and planning specifically to develop this solution-oriented model that we use at Black Men Heal, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And I am really I've learned so much by being the female founder of an organization that is primarily targeting Black men. I've learned so much about men in my practice as well as in this process. And one of the things that I have really learned is how to listen to men, right? And try to understand things from men's lens, because I knew that that was not a experience that is mine. And so I thought, what better way to start this off? Well, I'm going to go over the learning objectives first, and then we're going to actually start this off with what I spend a lot of my time doing, which is listening to men's experiences. So first, let's just go over the learning objectives we're going to do. Is that screen on? Kelsey, can we do there we go. Okay, so by the end of this, you guys will be able to identify the signs and effects of trauma and PTSD in Black men across the lifespan. You will be able to define 3 major barriers that men, people of color seek when, that come up when seeking mental health care treatment. You guys will be able to discuss, we're going to talk about mental health care needs and health disparities among diverse populations. And finally, we'll also talk about we'll talk about more, but by the end of this, I want you guys to be able to identify at least 3 ways to develop and apply cultural competency and trauma-informed approaches to treatment. We can go to the next slide. Thank you, Kelsey. Okay, so what you guys are gonna start off with is a video of, so Black Men Heal, let me just give a small little intro of Black Men Heal if you guys are not aware. It's a nonprofit organization started in 2018, and it was started as a solution to a crisis, what I saw as a crisis, which was in my private practice, I was not getting enough Black men that came in for treatment, right? And when I did get Black men that came in for treatment, they were either a part of a couple or they were very well off. So I saw basketball players, I saw judges, I saw doctors, I saw lawyers, because therapy is expensive. I don't take insurance. Well, I do take 1 or 2 insurances now, but and that just really started to weigh on my heart. Like I started to feel very conflicted to be complicit in a what I consider a very faulty mental health care system. And it was difficult for me to feel like this therapy process, which is so important for people to transform in their healing, but not enough people had access, right? So a lot of times people call me, they couldn't afford to see me, or there was other issues where I felt like I just wanted Black men to be able to have more of the opportunity and the access to be able to come in. And that's how Black Men Heal got started. So what we do is we give out 8 free sessions to men. So we jumpstart their healing journey. We give 8 free sessions. We also do a very, very extensive matching and pair up process. Anybody who's on this call, if you're part of the system, you already know finding the right mental health treatment and resources or therapy. Even if you have the money for therapy, or if you have insurance, finding the right therapist can be a very daunting and intimidating process, especially if you're already suffering and struggling with depression and you already have low levels of energy or hope. So the process is just so difficult. So we remove all of the barriers of the process by pairing the men up based off of whatever their presenting issues are, as well as their personality. We do a very extensive match-up process, almost like a match.com, like, you know, finding the right chemistry between provider and client to ensure we do that, because we're trying to control the variables to make sure that there's a very good therapeutic alliance, which increases the man's likelihood that he will continue with therapy and commit to his own mental health. So that's the whole premise. We're going to start it off with, in addition to the individual therapy we also offer a weekly group called King's Corner. It's a virtual group. All of the services are free. I don't know if I mentioned that, but it's a weekly group where every week there's a different topic applicable to men's mental health. And we have a different host each week as well. And because of everything that had been going on in the past month, it's also been, you know, like June has been a very stressful, traumatic time for myself and for a lot of Black people in the past month. It's been a very, I don't think, unprecedented time in the past month, I know for myself. So we had a group a couple weeks ago, right after the protests, after the result of the George Floyd murders. And this was from a clip you're going to see is of a gentleman that took place in that group, and him very emotionally describing his experience as a Black man and his experience of trauma. So I wanted to start it off by actually listening to Amel's experience. So Kelsey, we can play that when you're ready. Thank you.
Yes, and did you want to provide instructions for folks to react in the chat box?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. So while you guys are watching the video, I want you guys to use the chat box. Describe anything that's coming up for you as you're watching the video. So whatever your visceral reactions are, if you feel whatever physically comes up, mentally, emotionally comes up as you're watching this, you can put those words right in the chat, and we're going to talk about that and talk about just the process of trauma and what's experienced viscerally for people. It's very emotional. I've watched that several different times, and every time it feels like the first time, but it was even more powerful for me to watch it and to read your comments, which thank you so much. Everyone who commented, you guys really poured in, and I felt every single comment. And so many of the comments describe what I felt and what I was feeling, and my heartbeat pace starts to pick up, and I just feel very like jitters in my nervous system. And the reason why I wanted you guys to put into the chat what is coming up for you is because that's where trauma lives. Trauma lives in the body and in the nervous system. And when we experience something traumatic, it is triggered there all the time. So let's look at the actual definition of trauma. And we can come back to some of those comments. They were so powerful. And I know, we have limited time, but it's so much I wanted to pour into in the comments, but let's get through some of the slides first. So a traumatic event is anything that a person experiences, witnesses, or is confronted with, either actual, or it can be an actual or just the threat of something physical or psychologically damaging. Or it could also be the withholding of any type of material or related resources essential to healthy development. Trauma can be a single event or repeated events. And I think it's actually very important to put that in there because there's such a range of what can be experienced as traumatic. It's subjective of the way that somebody experiences it. It's like when you feel helpless. So it could be a car accident, or it could be something, physically happening to you that you feel like you might die, or it could be racism, right? It can be repeated levels of microaggression or repeated levels of feeling like you don't have equal rights, or what the brothers so eloquently and powerfully expressed in that video, his experiences of being someone who's fighting for a country that he does not feel is fighting for him. That's a very real traumatic experience for him. Can we go to the next slide? Slide 5. Oh, let me also just mention too, from that video, the brother that spoke, that group was on a Sunday. And you remember how you heard him say that he was going to be deployed very soon? That was a Sunday. He left for Afghanistan that Friday. And the fact that in that video, he says, there's a very, very real possibility that I might not come back. And I've signed up for that. And I know that that's a risk. But in between that week, right? This is why I love Blackman Hill and being a part of this organization, that I feel like now I don't have to feel as helpless as I used to feel, that I could actually do something, because he had reached out to our organization for therapy, but it was in between a cohort. We weren't ready to start a new cohort. But so many of the men that were on that call rallied around that brother. They because men come on that call from all over the country and beyond. We even have brothers from the UK. It's open to all men, not just Black men, but so many people supported him, including some of our therapists who were on the line, that we immediately after that call, we found out he was on the list waiting and he really needed a therapist. And one of the therapists from Blackman Hill reached out to him and gave him a few sessions that week. And he still asked to have those sessions. Even though he was going to be in Afghanistan, he was willing to figure out whatever the time difference was going to be able to still have those sessions. So I just wanted to put that out there because it felt good to be able to just offer something, right, to him. So we're on slide 5. Different types of trauma, right? So acute trauma is when there's like a single episode, like something that might happen once, like say, for example, like a car accident or some type of disaster. When you have one single episode of trauma, people have more ability to pull it together with levels of support. Another type is repetitive. That is when you have exposure to multiple ongoing chronic or prolonged trauma. So they have some examples under that category, like kidnapping, chronic or severe neglect, illnesses, history of physical, sexual assaults. Basically, when it comes to trauma, the greater the fragmentation is, the harder it is to pull it back together, or like how much more support is required. And then you have complex trauma, and that is when there is multiple chronic and prolonged overwhelming events and experiences, often within the context of either interpersonal relationships, family caregivers, long-term family effects, like family violence or child abuse. And then you have, can you go to slide 6, Kelsey? Thank you so much. Developmental trauma, that is like being exposed to trauma in utero. So it could be like neglect, abandonment, or anything within a child's caregiving system that interferes with the healthy attachment and development. And then you have intergenerational trauma, that is emotional and psychological. It is the transmission of historical oppression and its negative consequences across generations, the effects for different cultural groups, communities, or generations. So a perfect example of that, of course, would be slavery, right? What we just experienced in the past month, I never thought I would live through experiencing some of what has happened and transpired in the past month. The police murders were not new, but the outpour, the outcry of that. I never thought that I would experience that in my lifetime. Or my daughter, who's 9, who was asking me questions such as, Mom, why are people racist? Having to have those conversations and not knowing what to say to her, or not knowing how to say. I have a daughter, I don't have a son, but I've been hearing a lot from people about how those conversations with Black sons are even more heart-wrenching, right? So that was just something for me that was like, just very real. And, you guys can share that in the chats as well. That's a question I've been getting a lot. How do you talk to your kids about what's happening right now? So I don't have all the answers, by the way, and I'm going to be leaning on you guys just as much as I hope that you guys are able to lean on me today. But can we move to slide 7 on PTSD? PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Those are the results of the damaging results of what happens after we continuously re-experience trauma. And it's the hyperarousal symptoms that come up in our bodies when we have lived through, experienced, or witnessed extremely frightening or life-threatening events. So to make that applicable to what's happening right now, there are a lot of Black people and Black men who are absolutely terrified about getting stopped by the cops. So there might be white people who get stopped by the cops for a traffic violation, and it might, your level of heart rate might not go like this, or your level of your entire body, or I got to turn on my phone, or feeling like your life could be in danger based off of an interaction with the police officer. Now, some people might say that that's an irrational fear. At this point, it is absolutely not irrational for men of color to have that fear that happens, the trigger, because of everything that we're seeing and everything that we're experiencing. That's an example of PTSD. And the definition of trauma in the DSM has expanded to also include learning about a traumatic event of a friend or repeated exposure to details about a trauma. So what we know about trauma is, well, one, that trauma lives in the body and in the brain, and then the body and the brain works together as far as the triggers are concerned. But we also know that even you don't have to have been there to have learned about a traumatic experience. And so that's an example of slavery. Like 400 years ago, none of us in today's time, none of us have directly experienced slavery, but we have all, if you're a person of color, the intergenerational effects of racism and systemic oppression has been felt from 400 years ago. So that's an example of, you don't have to directly be there to have experienced the traumatic event in order for you to have PTSD symptoms. Can we go to slide 8, Kelsey? So complex PTSD, that is a distinct form of PTSD. There's a distortion of your core identity becomes like distorted because it's very like, what do you call it? Shaken up. And it can include significant emotional dysregulation. So those are some common examples of victims with complex PTSD. You can look at some of those. I'm not going to read everything on the slide, you guys, because I want us to get to questions. We're going to be stopping for questions, and you guys are also all going to have copies of the slides. I am very much so the type of presenter who I want to use the distinct pleasure and opportunity of this real life human interaction. So sometimes I might just be like, you know what, you can read that slide, but other times like Kelsey, and you can feel free to stop me. If something comes up in the chat and somebody has something to add, we can talk about that. Or if there's something we're talking about and you feel compelled to ask or share, please feel free. I'm not actually looking at the chat. So Kelsey, if you could help me monitor that, that'd be great.
Yeah, right now you're good, Taz, to
Okay.
keep moving forward. I'm monitoring a few things, but right now I think it's more commentary, and great commentary at that, but we can definitely come back to it.
Okay, great, thanks. So can we go to slide 9? Yes. So this is an example of the differences between, it's a chart, I'm a big visual learner, but the differences between PTSD and complex PTSD. So like if you're kind of thinking about that, if you're working with clients or clientele, and you're trying to differentiate between the differences of whether it's complex PTSD will feel chronic. It feels like you can't escape it. And that's very important to differentiate. And I think that's what's happening right now with a lot of Black men when it comes to racism and feeling levels of hope with some of the systemic oppression, not just Black men, but just people of color in general. We're going to talk about, can you go to slide 10? Historical trauma and what that looks like. Historical trauma. And I found this picture, which was so powerful to me. It's a group of slave children on a boat called the Daphne from back in history. But I thought it was just a very powerful picture. Can we go to slide 11? And then this quote I found, which I also thought was very powerful. History is not about the past, it's about the present. And just how everything that happens in the past is very much so related to the present. So historical trauma is an example of intergenerational trauma, and it's caused by events that target a group of people. Thus, even family members who, again, haven't directly experienced the trauma can feel the effects of it. And this concept, can we go to slide 12? This concept was developed by Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart in the 1980s as a way to develop a stronger understanding of why life for many Native Americans wasn't fulfilling the American dream. So she dove into a lot of that research to try to understand what was happening from this concept of historical trauma. And go to slide 13, please. I'm not sure how this picture will show up, but this is an awesome visual representation that shows pretty much like what it looks like from an intergenerational perspective. If your ancestors, for example, like they give 3 different examples, surviving the European wars and how your ancestors experiencing that, how it then relates to passing down from generation to generation. Because what happens is trauma affects your ability to relate and connect to people and your attachment style. So I'm a relationship therapist, so I do a lot of talking about attachment styles and what that looks like. But your levels of stress, your levels of PTSD, a lot of people, what do they do when they're feeling stressed and they don't know what to do with that stress? That's when drug, alcoholism is developed, things like domestic violence, sexual abuse, abandonment. All of these things are so related and co-intersect, which can also lead to low self-esteem, and it just passes down from generation to generation. So I felt like that was a really good visual representation. We can go to slide 14. And then there's this concept. Some of you may have heard of this before, this idea of post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is a condition that exists as a consequence of centuries of chattel slavery, followed by institutionalized racism and oppression that have resulted in multi-generational adaptive behavior. Some positive, reflecting resilience, and others that are harmful and destructive. And that theory was developed by Dr. Joy DeGray as a result of 12 years of quantitative and qualitative research. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so I need you guys' help. Again, you guys are killing it in the chats, but I found this one visual of, like, I wanted us to kind of brainstorm together. In addition to this one right here, this is the impact that you might think that racism might have on one's mental health. So there's some things in this box already, and I want you to think of what else might be there, and let's take a look at the chats. But on here we have feeling disconnected or lonely, second guessing things, self-doubt, decreased hope, increased survival mode, decreased trust, worry, feeling powerlessness, when you can do the right thing and still end up with a horrific outcome. I've been hearing that a lot from clients. Increased risk of depression, anxiety, existential questioning, how can the world be so cruel, panic attacks. What else? Let me go to the chats and see what else. Anger, hopelessness. Yes.
While folks are responding to that question in the chat box with their different ideas, we had one question, kind of framing, I think it's a good point of reflection here. And the audience member asked, as a community member who is, along with a partner and children, considered white and relates with some neighbor elementary age Black boys who play with her children, visit, etc., what is the best way to approach this for the Black boys? The best way to let them know about systemic racism, the danger of police, the double standard, expectations that they might encounter in their whole lives. One way, one may be drawn to address this with the boys, but on the other hand, doesn't want to overstep or cause harm. So how do we, I think this question is about how as allies can neighbors be conscientious and support their children's Black peers?
I think that's a great question. And actually, before I give some of my thoughts on it, like, is there anybody else in the chat? Like, if you want to speak on that in the chat, does anybody else want to speak on that? Let's see. I've been hearing that a lot about how to be allies, right? And I like the idea of like not wanting to overstep, right? My first thoughts on that is to ask, right? Like to ask if you can be an ally, to ask if you can support, or to ask how to be able to listen. I always think the very first way to offer anyone help, because there's all these programs that come up that develop, and like I said, my experience of starting an organization for men as a woman was the very first thing I had to do was go and listen to a whole lot of men's experiences, right? So being able to listen and to ask. I see some other things up here. Parents need to talk to parents about these issues. It's a family-centered healing. Yes. I love the idea of teaching your kids about race. And I don't think teaching your kids about race should solely be for people of color to have to do that. I think that kids should be taught about race, because I think that's our best chance for really trying to change it generationally, is to teach people about what that means and what that looks like. I know me as a parent, and I'm curious if other people have had this experience, I have resented having to talk to my daughter at a young age about race, because that's not my choice to do, right? My choice would be for my child to be a child and to not ask me questions like, Mom, is Donald Trump racist? She asked me that question when she was 5 years old. And she didn't get that from me, because I would never want my daughter to even think about the world as a horrific place such as that, right? But it has, for me, I've thought like maybe this needs to be a curriculum in schools. Like they do Black History Month and they teach about our history, but what about in all of the pain and the struggles? But I actually think teaching how to be like anti-racist should be a curriculum that is something that every parent should have to do with their children. I see some other ideas.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think you really captured what also was in the chat box, and I'd refer the audience member who asked that question to the chat as well, because there were a
Nice.
diversity of great ideas that came in there. And then you also had folks that were responding to the question that you asked about the current slide on what do we feel the impacts of racism are on mental health, and we had to sort of redirect folks back to that question. Some of the answers were around hopelessness and rage, feeling defensive, that these can be symptoms of racism impacting mental health.
Yeah, I see that. Great answers, you guys. Oh, and somebody, just to comment on something I'm reading now. I did some research. Currently, it's only about 2% of their overall law enforcement taught about culture diversity training as well as mental health training. That is so important. Mental health training for police officers. I mean, in addition to diversity, I don't know if diversity training honestly would change that much. And I don't know if that's me. And is that my impact of racism on mental health, that I feel hopeless around that? But the mental health part is very crucial, because there are a lot of times like this just happened last week. Somebody called me since the George Floyd, it was a friend's friend, like a friend's cousin, and they were calling me to consult about what they should do, because the husband, it was a husband and a wife, and the husband was 38 years old, had never had any type of mental health issues. And ever since the George Floyd murders, he had become increasingly, basically he was having a psychological break. the levels of anxiety and fear had increased substantially. And he was paranoid because he was watching all of the news, taking all of that into his nervous system, into his mind and his body. And he was acting very erratically and speaking very like fearful. His wife was terrified. They had an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. His wife was terrified to call anybody because she did not feel like it would be safe to call anybody in the system when he was spewing a lot of erratic things and paranoia, and like he had a lot of nervous, jittery behaviors. So she kind of let this go on for weeks and was just hoping, like was trying to turn off the news and was hoping he would kind of snap out of it. He started posting some stuff that was real concerning on social media, and that's how a friend of mine's got a hold of it, because she called her cousin, the wife, and was like, is everything okay? And that's when they came to find out that the wife was like, I think he's having some type of psychotic break. They lived in Atlanta, but she was just like, I'm not calling authorities. Because the idea of the fact that somebody could be having a mental health crisis and the fear now of feeling like I'm going to put his life in danger if I call the authorities, because he's so paranoid that he's feeling like if anybody comes, I have to protect my family. What do you think is going to happen if the police are coming and you're trying to tell them that, wait, he's having a psychotic break? I don't think police know how to de-escalate without, at this point, not for Black people anyway. I think they have that skill to use, but when it comes to Black men who are seen as such a threat, they just don't seem to use de-escalation tactics as much. But what happened in this situation, we were able to call a mobile crisis team. And at this point, the man had so much fear of white people that it took a little bit longer, but they were able to gather a group of all Black mental health crisis mobile team members to go and talk to the man. So he was able to go and he admitted himself. So instead of it being like an involuntary admission, it ended up being a voluntary admission because he had a team of people that came and supported him and was able to kind of talk him down. But when I thought about that, I was like, see, how much is that happening? I know with Blackman Hill, we have gotten a surge of increase of men applying, and specifically on their applications, citing exactly what's going on in the media right now. Everything that's happening is the increase in their levels of fear, paranoia. A lot of them are losing family members to COVID. So it's very real. And when you think of that level of stress that's happening, right? You may have already had some underlying depression, and then you are like at your brink, the complex PTSD, and something like that happens, and it caused a temporary psychosis for the man. He went to the hospital for a couple of days and he's okay now. But that's a really good example of how mental health needs to be specifically, like how do you respond to somebody who's having a mental health break, right? So it just made me think about that. Anything in the chats we should attend to, Kelsey?
No, I think we're good to keep moving on, but we definitely will come back to folks. You can continue to put questions in there or comments. I'm monitoring it consistently. But yeah, we'll move on.
So let's go to slide 16. Trauma in Black men. So studies that are examining trauma exposure among 62% have directly experienced a traumatic event in their lifetime. 72% have witnessed a traumatic event. 59% have learned of a traumatic event involving a friend or a family member. And that stat is not as up to date as it needs to be, so we need to redo those stats, but that was from the CDC 2016. Trauma has been identified as a major public health and medical issues, and Black males age 18 and over are at a noticeably higher risk for trauma exposure. And severe and or chronic trauma can have lasting adverse effects on physical, psychological, and social well-being. We can go to 17. Health effects of trauma. So trauma can affect the brain, which results in behaviors and emotions that appear maladaptive, and it has an extremely high correlation with poor health and social outcomes. So you guys might be familiar with the tool, the ACE, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences. That's one of the largest scientific research studies of its kind. It shows the link between childhood trauma and the chronic disease people develop as adults, as well as social and emotional problems. You can keep going in the slides, Chelsea. So the ACE basically shows this is the connection between the higher amount of adverse childhood experiences you have, that it leads to disrupted neurodevelopment, which leads to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, can lead to adoption of health risk behaviors. Again, the increase of drug, alcohol behaviors, diseases, obesity, social problems, and early death. Can we go to the next one? The ACEs can have lasting effects on a lot of health and obesity issues. So I want you guys to think about this in relation to COVID-19, what's happening right now with the disproportionate number of African Americans, specifically men, who are dying from COVID, and why that is. All of this stuff, remember, history is actually still the present. So all of these things are so intercorrelated because of the underlying health issues that were existent for people of color. And those are, it's not a coincidence that people are, Black people are dying more so from COVID, becoming affected more, or why they have so many more severe underlying health issues and are dying more. So all of that is very connected as well. Can we move on to slide 21, Kelsey? So
yeah, am I on the right one?
21. We're gonna skip over 20.
Over
I was gonna have
okay.
a discussion about, I wanted you guys can think about that later, but like the ACE, I have had some issues with the ACE in itself because I don't feel like it's the most culturally competent tool, even though it is one of the main scientific tools that we have. But I have seen clients, Black male clients, who've taken the ACE and scored very low, even though they've had multiple layers and layers of trauma, because the ACE isn't accurately capturing their unique cultural experiences. So that's a discussion for another day. But
you have some folks in the chat that are seconding what you just said. So yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, like this could be a 5-hour webinar, truthfully, if we were to go into so much of it. But I want to try to get to specifically why don't Black men go to therapy? I put that caption up to be facetious, to be honest, because what happened, well, let's look at this first, and how I actually don't believe that anymore, because yeah, I have an organization where we have like 800 men who want to come to therapy. We have very little slots available. But why don't Black men go to therapy? So there's been a lot of research that is documenting the link between trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, substance use, and violence perpetration. And the frequency of trauma, we talked about this, of Black males age 18 and over, puts them at greater risk for experiencing one or more of these outcomes that may require mental health service use. Nevertheless, Black males are half as likely to their white counterparts to use professional mental health services, even after you adjust for social, economic, and clinical factors. I want to speak to that specifically too, because what I have found from Blackman Hill is not an income-based program. It is for Black men to basically increase the likelihood that they would actually go to therapy. And I must say, from what we see, like, we get a lot of low income people who apply, but honestly, we also get a lot of men who apply for Blackman Hill, 8 free sessions, who make between $100,000 and $150,000 a year. We were just seeing this, like, just recently. And most of them have insurance. So why are they coming to a program of Blackman Hill, right, to apply for a very limited, because we have limited resources, limited slot, but they're coming through us. When I was looking at that, I was like, oh, these men can afford therapy, right? These men could have afforded my price, right? But it's more to it than just the fact that we offer free therapy, because we also are helping to remove the stigma, because that's another part of, the concept of, like, why don't Black people go to therapy, is like the stigma that exists around shame, and the difficulty that also exists with finding a Black therapist, finding somebody who looks like you. Because if you call your insurance card on the back of your, if you call the back of your insurance card, like 90% of the list that they give you are not going to be people who look like you. Partly because there's not, there's only 15% of Black people, we're minorities. So it's only 15% of us in this country, but also because there's not a lot of Black therapists. And if you are a Black therapist in this field, I know for me in private practice, you're swamped. Like it's definitely a good field to go into, especially private practice, because you're not going to have a shortage of clients. You're not going to have difficulty getting a lot of people, but it's really difficult to go to therapy if you feel like you have to explain or educate. Like that's not something a client should have to do, to explain or educate the experience of what it's like to be Black to your therapist. And I've heard a lot of people come to me in therapy and they've come from other therapists that didn't look like them. And they've said that I didn't think therapy worked because I felt judged, or, you know, like the Black man comes in therapy and is explaining a lot of microaggressions, and somebody else might be like, oh, well, maybe it's just a cognitive distortion, right? So that's another big reason. So we do those 3 different elements to Blackman Hill. We make it free. We also, we're pairing them up with a therapist who not only looks like them, but we're also pairing them up with a therapist who is qualified and skillful to meet their specific presenting issues. That's the other thing. The average person applying for therapy doesn't know, like, for example, I don't do drug and alcohol, right? But somebody might find me online and like, oh, I'm looking for a Black therapist and they want to come to me, but that's not my area. So most people call me all the time with every type of issue for therapy. And I'm like, that's actually not my area, but the average person may not know that. So we take away all of that work for them, but we have a very extensive application process that allows us to assess. Even in the application, we're already clinically assessing what their issues and their needs are, down to whether or not this man needs somebody who's a little bit more nurturing because he has these issues with his mother. See right here in this application, he has these issues with his mother and he's still seeking, you know, a maternal nurturance, versus this man needs somebody who's a lot more direct, versus this man needs another male, versus this man needs a female. So we do so much extensive work for them. And I think that's why we get so many Black men that apply, because we've made it this space that it's just for them. How many spaces do you think Black men have that are just for them? Other than maybe fraternities, Black fraternities, the barbershop, I'll give them that, the Black barbershops, we have a couple different organizations, but not many. And that's one of the reasons why I started Blackman Hill, because I didn't feel like they had enough spaces for themselves, or the church or religious institutions, but not many. Can we go to slide 23, Kelsey? Okay, so Black men and mental health. African Americans compared with white Americans have slightly lower prevalence estimates of lifetime major depressive disorder. However, African Americans have depressive episodes that are actually more disabling, more persistent, and more resistant to treatment relative to their white counterparts. Men in general, regardless of their race or ethnicity, have lower rates of mental health care service use for a range of reasons, including for men in general, like think about the masculinity mask, right? You guys know about how, you know, we're talking about stigma. A lot of men are conditioned. I have a very diverse practice, so I'm actually blessed to work with many men of many different races. But I will say that I've learned so much about working with men in therapy that's one thing that they all have in common, is like this idea that somehow needing support around a mental health issue is not masculine. So you have that issue as well. And I already talked about those 3 major areas of barriers for Black men: socioeconomic, the social-cultural, being paired up with someone who looks like you. Yes, we do. I see that comment, Laura. We need more African-American male therapists. Yes, we absolutely do. Misdiagnosis and clinical bias. So that's another one that's important that we could talk about as well. Misdiagnosis and clinical bias is huge, because that doesn't just occur mental health wise, but that also occurs in the medical health field, not just for Black men, but Black women. There's a ton of studies around that as well, is that doctors underestimate Black people's pain and symptoms. Also, we could also dive into a discussion about how depression looks very, very different in men than it does in women. And so often it can be missed. A lot of times Black men might go to the doctor and complain about physical ailments, because depression starts to ail them, back pains and knee pains and things like that. So the idea of them being depressed might be missed by the practitioner who is assessing them. And those are all things that play into why it's misdiagnosed. Can we go to slide 24? Men are often encouraged to tough out illness for as long as possible because asking for help can appear as a weakness. And that's something that I think just needs to change in general from masculinity, gender norms. And can we go to 25? Thank you. Racial discrimination. We already talked about social economic. We can move on from that. Inferior social positioning among minority group members could cause impaired psychological functioning. And everyday forms of discrimination referred to as microaggressions. I definitely wanted to get to that. That microaggressions is very overt, subtle acts of racial discrimination because they're so subtle. They often can't be like proved or like, you know, like it might be examples might be being, you know, oh, you speak so well, right? Or they can be extremely subtle. Can somebody put in the chat examples of microaggressions? And that term was developed by Dr. Chester Price. And a lot of people of color specifically who work in corporate, I work with so many actually successful Black men who work in corporate environments who talk about microaggressions in their therapy constantly, or being more qualified than, you know, their counterparts, being more qualified and feeling like the guy in the video said, like you have to be 5 times as better, but still getting passed over for promotions and very little room for advancement in the cultural corporate ladder. Those are examples of microaggressions as well.
We have so many coming through the chat box right now that
oh wow, yeah,
would really tell
You're
people
so pretty
to
for
go
a Black
take a
girl.
look at. Yeah.
Wow, good examples, you guys. Love it. Mispronouncing names repeatedly, even after 5 years. Wow. Touch his hair without asking. I remember at one point being when I started my practice. Well, my practice was a little bit different, but I remember having a job once where I used to hate, even though I wanted to change my hair up sometimes, I didn't, because I'm like, I don't want my appearance to become a topic of conversation at work, right? And I'm like, how many people have to think about that or worry about that, right? I don't care about those things anymore, but I definitely can remember that example for myself. These are really good examples. Thank you guys for helping out with this. Let's go to 26. Let's talk about the cultural mistrust of healthcare providers in general. So do you guys know about the history of how cultural mistrust was developed? And it kind of started around, so there used to be medical experimentations. African Americans were used during slavery and beyond for medical experiments. And so that laid the foundation for mistrust towards healthcare providers. The one that is most famous is the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the male Negro, which was, this was one of the longest infamous U.S. Public Health Service longitudinal studies by government scientists in rural Alabama. That's from 1932 to 1972. So just think about that. That wasn't that long ago. You know, we're talking about slavery 400 years ago, but this African Americans were used for medical experimentation as recent as 1972. So that study, they studied the effects of syphilis on a group of African American men. And although they had discovered that penicillin was used to treat syphilis in the 1940s, scientists intentionally withheld this medication to learn the consequences of untreated syphilis among study participants. So that's something that really sticks out in the mind as some of the cultural mistrust of healthcare providers. Also, go to 27, please. Slide 27. Oh, thank you. Mental health professionals also may harbor negative perceptions of African American men that affect their diagnostic assessment. And African Americans are more likely to utilize psychiatric emergency services compared with white Americans. And also which also may contribute to inconsistent follow-up and high attrition rates from outpatient care, more likely to be committed for involuntary inpatient treatment. And police involvement leads to higher rates of involuntary psych hospitalizations for men of color. So those are all some factors that contribute to that. And that makes me think of the story I was just telling you guys about how by using a mobile crisis team of color, like that story I was just telling you guys, they were able to get that man who was having a psychiatric break to sign himself in, as opposed to it becoming violent or becoming involuntary. Last is misdiagnosis, number 28, misdiagnosis and clinician bias. We're going to do like another 15 minutes, you guys, and then we're going to stop and do some conversation and questions. But the misdiagnosis and clinician bias with major depressive disorder, African Americans are more likely to have somatic symptoms such as sleep and pain compared to white Americans with major depressive disorders. And the negative perceptions of African Americans can also affect the diagnosis. Some examples of that are underestimating someone's cognitive capacity. Psychological issues may seem more simplistic. Providers can disproportionately diagnose African American men with schizophrenia or other more severe psychotic disorders compared with white men, who are more likely to be diagnosed with mood disorders. And clinical errors are found even when providers use structured diagnostic interviews. Also, providers may misinterpret and cultural mistrust as pathological symptoms. So, like, for example, like if somebody like doesn't trust healthcare providers, that might seem like a symptom that might be like more like paranoia, as opposed to it's actually just very valid basis, basically. Thank you, Kelsey. So here's a chart that for you guys. Nearly 17% of African Americans were uninsured in 2014, as compared to 11% for white Americans. And only 53% of African Americans diagnosed with major depressive disorders received mental health care in 2011, compared to 73% for white Americans. And also, in a study conducted by the APA, researchers found that 83.6% of active psychologists were white Americans. I saw somebody in the chat say that, yes, we do need more people of color in fields such as ourselves. And that's one of the other goals that we have with Blackman Hill, is going into the schools and helping to advocate for people who are in schools and choosing majors, especially for Black men, to come more into the field, for sure. There's only like 4% of psychologists are Black. Can we go to, I already talked about Blackman Hill and what that does. So could we go to slide 39?
What's the title for that one, Kaz?
39 is culturally competent, trauma-informed approaches.
There we go. We're there.
Thank you. Okay. So these are some really good ideas. So you guys all have the slides, and I saw as you guys were introducing yourselves, you're from a range of different agencies and backgrounds, which is so amazing that we can all come together for a webinar such as this. But I think these are pretty good culturally competent, trauma-informed approaches for all of us. So some of those questions people were asking, I'll just briefly go through those, and then we're going to stop and have some discussion. But so creating space for race, like that is allowing an open dialogue with our communities about race. And I want to say that's so important. One of the things that was very much so echoed in sentiment I've heard from people of color who work at organizations or corporations. So, and to me, this is a big part of what Black trauma is. Black trauma is having to be traumatized over and over and over again, right? And then show up at work and no one else even mentions it, and everyone else pretends it doesn't exist. Because well before George Floyd happened, like the police issues were, murders and brutality was occurring all the time, or the things that were happening on the news. Right now, for some reason, it got a lot of outreach. I don't know if it was pandemic induced or not, but those are issues that have been very, very real in the Black community for a long time. And so I've heard a lot of people say, like, when you're traumatized about these things happening and then you go to work, it's been a lot of jobs, even with the George Floyd murders, where no one mentioned anything. It's like you had to go to work being extremely traumatized, wanting to break down and cry, and everything else just kept it moving. So I like this idea of creating space for race, like not just from a micro level, like with your coworkers, but from an institutional, from a structural level, I think is important. Also, affirmation and acknowledgement. Professionals helping individuals develop a sense of understanding and acceptance of racial issues. Racial storytelling, that is giving individuals an outlet to share personal experiences and think critically about events in their lives. So creating an opportunity to hear about what other people's experiences are and being able to hold the space for that. Validation, the process of naming that there's research that shows the effect of racial trauma on mental health. And the ability to just like name an experience is actually very helpful to one's ability to actually then connect to it. And when you can name what you feel, what I tell my clients all the time is, if you don't know what you feel, you won't know what you need. So I teach clients a lot of how to name what their emotions are, what their experiences are. Let's see, there's a couple more, but I want to, just for timing purposes, can we go to 40, slide 40? I can't wait to get to you guys' comments. I'm like so anxious to get through this because I want to talk. So the slide 40, culturally competent trauma-informed approaches. So these are some clinical recommendations to improve care for us frontline mental health care workers. So building a therapeutic alliance that preserves African-American men's masculinity and cultural identity, that can acknowledge cultural distrust associated within the healthcare system, and acknowledge just psychosocial stressors unique to African-American men. So one of the things I would say to, you know, some of my white peers and colleagues and allies is that, you know, don't pretend not to see race, right? Like, I think this whole idea sometimes when people say, oh, I don't see color, it could be kind of offensive, especially because we don't have the option of not being very aware of our color within the world, right? So like, just like naming that and acknowledging it and asking people about their distrust and if it's there, and inviting. What I found with Black Men Heal is we invite that space in, and by inviting it in, you'll be surprised about how many people might be actually willing to engage in it. So that's one tip. And also, it's very important to inquire about social support networks and kinship and spirituality. Like listen to clients about what is their social support networks and family and what they have, because building that up is actually very important and trying to encourage that. Also, using a holistic health approach to treating depression and anxiety. I know for me, by working with Black men, the idea, like if you go too quickly to this idea of medication, you're gonna lose them, right? Because again, think about this whole cultural mistrust. So you can't, like if somebody comes in for depression and you immediately go to medication, my clients tell me right off the bat, I'm not doing the medication thing, right? And don't get me wrong, because I'm not a medication pusher, but there are times when medication is absolutely needed. I've been in this field for 15 years now, right? And so I have like a 5-point system that I help clients with, where I'm like, okay, sometimes depression and things like that is absolutely a neurological issue. So I try to help people with it from physical, like a holistic approach. We look at it physically. So, you know, I'm going to be asking them about their diet, their sleep, their exercise, what's going on in their physical life and how important that is. And then from lifestyle structure perspective, how much stress they have, their jobs, from a also social support, I'm gonna be looking at that. I'm gonna be asking them about spirituality. And then I also ask them about like cognitive, like healing things, like, you know, how often they have like cognitive distortions or negative thought processes. So I call that their 5 kids, right? So I'm like, okay, I get it. You don't want any medications. That's fine, because I'm a very holistic provider. So we can look at all of these other ways to treat depression and anxiety. And you got to pretend that these are your 5 kids. Before you even get to your other kids, if you have these 5 areas of physical, lifestyle, structure, cognitive, emotional, social support, and spiritual, if you are consistently attending to and nurturing those 5 areas, right, your depression and anxiety is going to decrease. So if you're in therapy with me and we working on these 5 areas, cool. You're going to notice a decrease in your depression and anxiety. But if you're doing these things and your depression and anxiety does not decrease, it's a neurological issue. It's a chemical imbalance, and then we will have to look at and explore that. That makes it a little bit safer because they know I'm not just like trying to push pills on them. I'm trying to teach them a whole array of holistic ways to treat their approach, and I think that's a good approach to take with men of color. Also, this is very, very, very important, is that providers should explore their own internalized racial bias and develop cultural humility. There's another thing I want to say about that too. I think that Black people and women, I'm going to use myself, actually. I'm going to put myself out there on the chopping board. Since I have started an organization for Black men, one of the first things that started to come up for me as a woman is the ways in which I also held ideas of toxic masculinity internalized for myself and how that was biased. So like I had to really look within myself for, you know, like if I've gone through my own issues with Black men, if I've gone through my own issues of pain, I mean, I've been the collateral damage of Black men's pain from my father to other men in relationship as well. I had to really do my own work around my own biases around that. So when I was around, you know, ladies, when you get with your group of friends and you know, sit around and you have your wine and talk to your girlfriends, and like the man bashing, nope, like does not exist for me anymore. Like that was something for myself where I had to start looking at the way in which I thought about and felt about Black men. So Blackman Hill, one of the best things about Blackman Hill is that like there's been so much forgiveness and compassion, and it has completely shifted my lens and the way in which I look at men. So that's an example of how that may not have been a racial bias, but it most certainly was a gender bias. We all have biases. I don't care whether you're Black, whether you're white, whether you're male or female, we have them. And if you can explore them and know what they are, that's going to help you in your work to be able to know what you need to overcome. Okay. Let's go to, let me see, do I want to do, so the rest of the slides I was talking about, like Black people dying from COVID-19. And I think that you guys could really explore that on your own if you don't mind. I'm kind of anxious to engage with you guys, if that's okay. Can we go to, we're going to go to some questions, but can we go to slide 46 before we get to the chats? Because these were just some general conclusion, critical discussion, questions and answers that I had up, and then we're going to dive into the chats. And I want all of this wonderful experience that I saw you guys put in. You're from all different types of agency and organization. I want to learn from you. Please help me learn from you. I look forward to this the most about presenting. And then we're going to go to these. But here are some discussion and questions and answers that I had that we can think about in our discussions, even though I know there's already some juicy stuff we can go to the chats for. But how do we change health inequities, right? And how do we change broken systems, broken mental health systems, broken healthcare systems? What impact do you think the George Floyd murder or a subsequent outrage will have on change or hope to? And how do we achieve legislative structural changes within this field? So those are some of my general throw out there questions. And let's go to the chats. Hold on.
Yeah, Taz, I'm just going to take a pause for 1 second, just so we can restructure and give people some due time for their questions. Everyone's saying that they've loved it so far and we need a part 2. So just as we have 2 general questions that I'd love to pose to you as we transition. And then I'll just provide some closing material. We will stop the recording at around 4 o'clock when we were scheduled to end. But if Taz is willing, which I think she is, we'll stay on, and then people can have a really full, robust discussion for another 20 to 30 minutes if you have the time in your schedules. So that's sort of how we're restructuring right now. And the good thing about that is the recording will be stopped, so you won't have your personal questions asked on our live recording. So with that, the 2 general questions, Taz, that came, one was, particularly, how can we make that connection or provide adequate care without enough Black clinicians? What can we do given our current state right now?
Yeah, that's actually, I like that question too. We don't have enough Black providers, right? Even though we're finding a lot. So, but I think that going back to that idea around what we can do as providers is, again, making sure that you are committed to your own level of cultural competency, because, you know, I have a ton of white peer colleagues and allies and my supervisors who I still pay for my clinical training, but just amazing people who I learned so much from. And so I think being able to know, like, for yourself, like what your own, like, do some specific work around there. There's a lot of, we could do a part 2 on this, just on like some different tools and things like that you can do. And there's so much stuff out there. Like, there's so much stuff out there, and maybe you guys can put some of this stuff in the chats too, because I felt around the time of the George Floyd stuff, I did get a little overwhelmed with white friends asking me for research, right? Because I felt like, well, there's Google, right? And I don't mean to be facetious with that, but I felt exhausted. Like, I felt like I didn't want to have to do the labor for anybody. I felt like I was doing the very best that I could to hold on to my own mental health, and I didn't want to have to be people's resource. That's kind of what I felt, but that was a very conflicted feeling, being in the field where this is what I do, right? So that's my thoughts. But let me see, what are some people saying about that in the chats? I've gotten a lot of good tips from other people. Educating can be re-traumatizing. Yes, that is a very good way of summing up what I was feeling. Yes. How can we get involved in Blackman Hill? Oh, you guys can go to blackmanhill.org to get involved, and you can go to our social pages to find us. We're always looking for providers. I am willing to stay on afterwards if anybody can, to answer more questions and to engage in more conversation.
Yeah, I think one general question, Taz, before we just stop the recording and then open it up for that larger discussion. Again, everyone, we're going to stay on the line, and we have the line for as long as we want it. So for those who do have an open afternoon and want to keep the conversation going, we're going to provide that for you. But one of the last questions that I wanted to capture on the recording is about the Sunday group. We had someone ask, can any men of color join the Sunday group? I'm
so glad you asked that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Not just men of color though, like all men. We had a group, military and mental health, last Sunday. This Sunday the topic is what is it? Is men managing stress. I know one of my guys from the team is on this call. I can't remember the name of it, but it's about stress management for men. And so all men are invited. It's not just Black men. We have Latino men. We had white men in the military mental health group. But yeah, it's become allies. It's become a brotherhood, a way for you guys to really support each other. It's free for all men age 18 and over. So you guys can sign up. You have to register to sign up to get the link every week from our website, blackmanhill.org, or go to our social pages to sign up. A lot of people are asking me how to get involved with Blackman Hill. Yes, please get involved with Blackman Hill. We need you. We need all the help we can get. You can make donations to Blackman Hill, and you can also volunteer. Well, actually, you know what? We're not taking volunteers anymore. I forgot. We actually have been doing this work unpaid for 2 years, and we're just now starting to earn enough funds to pay our providers. So we actually do pay the providers. Jay, like, that is a big step. But there's so many different ways that you can help a mission like this, and we're expanding nationally. So right now we service PA, Delaware, New Jersey, and New York City. But yes, Reg, the guy from my team, is going to put the information about the King's Corner in the chats. Yes, please reach out to me. My information is on the slides, and if you guys, there's more follow-up, I can be available on the call, or you guys could also reach out to me after the meeting.
For sure. And if anyone has trouble getting in touch with Taz, you can always contact me, Kelsey Leonard, and I'll show my contact information, and I can connect you both. It was a general question for Taz around, do you guys do trainings? Does Blackman Hill do
Yes,
trainings? People
we
want
do.
you.
We absolutely do. And right now, and that's one of the most exciting parts about Blackman Hill, is that we have gotten such amazing opportunity, especially over the past month, in partnering with organizations such as this, and also huge organizations that we've been in meetings with. And I've even had an opportunity to be a part, have a seat at the table with Congress over the past couple of weeks about how to change some of these legislative structural issues that exist within the broken mental health care system, and how to get more providers. Oh, back to that question of how to get more Black providers. This is one of the things that we do with Blackman Hill that I feel like is helping us to expand. We're not just helping the clients, we're also helping a whole network of Black clinicians become licensed. That's the incentive for people to sign up. We take unlicensed providers. So think about it. In a lot of ways in which people of color experience barriers, there's also barriers. Like if you get your master's in counseling, there's a lot of red tape around licensure that exists in PA, depending on what your licensure is. But we're doing a lot of work around that. So we provide the supervision for our providers, and it also helps them build hours and clinical hours towards licensure, and we give them free supervision. So it's an incentive. We're also trying to create a whole network of providers. We realized there was a lot of master's level good therapists who were Black, but they might have been an agency but not licensed, right? And so now we're also helping to try to bridge that gap as well. So I know I sound biased, you guys, but I am such a fan of Blackman Hill. It's a blessing to be a vessel for this organization, but I am such a fan of it because it is doing so much, it's making so much impact for the clients as well as for the providers. And if you go to our page, you can see a lot of testimony from men who have come through our program, who talk about what their experience was like with their therapists. And this is the other thing I forgot to mention that I'm so proud about. 60% of our men that come through for free, they stay with their therapists, and they stay and they pay for therapy. They're actually just paying for therapy afterwards. We give them the jump start, but they become so committed to mental health, to their own mental health, that they stay. They refer their friends. They tell their other homies about it. And so then they help become mental health advocates themselves, because now they're willing to talk about and be transparent about their own mental health experiences. And the concept is heal men, heal men. If one man steps into a space of vulnerability, then he is inviting another one of his brothers to step into that space as well. So it's really become like a movement now. I know some of you guys have to leave. Yes, we wonderful. Do trainings. You guys can reach out to me. So there's the link for King's Corner.
Yeah, so Taz, Reginald just posted the links for the socials for Black Men Heal, as well as for King's Corner registration into the chat box, so folks can take a look there. Just so we can stop the recording and actually get to some of the discussion, I'm just going to close out with some of our reminders for folks. So if you love today's session and you want to hear more from Black Men Heal and other really great speakers, we're going to look into part 2s and 3s and 4s and what that might look like. But in the meantime, next week we do have the Black Urban Gardeners talking about healing through gardening for youth who face trauma. And so we encourage you to register for that session. It's for next Thursday, same time, 2:30 to 4. Again, cultural competence and linguistic competence are a life's journey, not a destination. So we're wishing everyone safe travels, and that you take care and stay safe during these difficult times. Again, my email is leonardkt@upmc.edu. If anyone has any questions or would like additional resources after today's session. So again, thank you all for participating. We're going to stop the recording and open it up to discussion at this time. For those who can stay on, feel free to stay on. If you need to sign off, we hope you'll join us at one of our future sessions. Thanks again.